Hey everybody. In this lecture, we're going to talk about superheroes as super reformers in comic books, supporting some of the more interventionist activities of the federal government, some of the policies of the New Deal. And then we're going to talk about World War II and how the circumstances of World War II affected and in some ways helped popularize comic books in American culture. All right, so let's get into it. So, in the last lecture, we talked about the context of the Great Depression and how comic books and some of the superheroes in comic books could serve as defenders of the common man, protector of the little guy. Well, Brad Wright, in your chapter that you read for this week, also talks about superheroes as kind of super reformers, supporting some of the more interventionist policies of the New Deal, the idea that the government needs to do more, to be more involved in people's lives. And this is a cell from a Superman comic book that Wright talks about in the book. There's a storyline where there's some kids getting into trouble. What back in the day they were described as juvenile delinquents and causing problems. And Superman can't have that, so Superman stops these kids from causing trouble. But one of the mothers sort of pleads with Superman and acknowledges that what her son was doing was wrong and that he shouldn't have been doing it, but she blames it on the environment, the bad neighborhood that they lived in, the lack of options that were available there. And this gets Superman thinking. In this cell, he says, it might be difficult for you to make out here, it's not entirely your fault that you're delinquents. It's these slums, your poor living conditions. If there was only some way I could remedy it. And then Superman he reads in the paper about a tornado that hits Florida and wipes out an entire town. And this gives Superman an idea. What he decides to do is flatten this poor neighborhood. Just knock all the buildings down. And after this, the government can come in and build nice, new, clean public housing. Inexpensive, affordable, but also very nice, and change the environment for these young people. This was a really radical idea. The idea back in the 1930s of government housing, or that it was the government's responsibility to provide housing for the poor, was very much a radical idea. And here we have Superman being an advocate of this very idea. And so Wright gives all kinds of examples from storylines of the Superman taking the side of the poor and the working class and broader segments of middle class America against the rich and the powerful. Brad Wright talks about a Superman storyline in which a mine operator has not provided adequate safety measures for his miners, and there's a cave-in and a collapse, and some of the miners get trapped, and of course Superman comes to save the day and rescues the miners, and the miners tell Superman, hey, the conditions here have been terrible. We've been pleading for them to do something about this. This was inevitable. A problem like this was going to happen. And so Superman talks to the mine owner to ask him to make changes, and the mine owner is dismissive about all this. And so Superman, frustrated with this response, decides to put the mine owner in one of his own mines, collapse the mine, let that mine owner feel what it was like to be trapped in that environment. And then, of course, Superman rescues the mine owner. And now that the mine owner has experienced this feeling of helplessness, he decides to provide better safety and working conditions for his workers. Okay. And it wasn't just Superman that was taking these advocacy positions in these comic books. Okay, so pay attention to what Wright has to say, is sort of describing these early superheroes as kind of supporters of reform and change in the position of the little guy. Now, let's talk about comic books and youth culture. One of the things that happens as we start getting into the 20th century is that young people are spending more time together. Okay. Earlier in American history, children grew up quicker. For a lot of American history, we didn't even have this concept of adolescence, or this idea that your teenage years are a kind of in-between period between childhood and adulthood. You transition from childhood to adulthood more quickly. Say, for example, you're a 15-year-old and you're going to school, but you realize you're going to apprentice for your uncle as a plumber. Well, you've basically learned how to read and write as well as you're going to need to be a plumber. So, why stick around for another few years and finish your high school diploma? Nobody that's ever had a clogged sink has asked for their plumber to provide a diploma before they get their sink unclogged. And so you drop out of high school and go start apprenticing for your uncle, and you transition to that world of adults more quickly. But as we're moving on into the 20th century, young people are staying in school longer, particularly during the Great Depression. Since there weren't a lot of jobs for young people during the Great Depression, and knowing that jobs are going to be difficult to get, some more young people are staying in school longer, hoping a degree will help them get a job. And so we're getting a greater sense of generational difference, that young people are starting to feel more like a distinct group. And comic books become one of their things that sort of separates them and makes them feel different. Helps create this sort of cohesion of, we are different from older generations because we like these comic books. And comic books were not just simply things that told stories, but there was also advertising in comic books. And increasingly, comic books were being used to advertise directly to young people, even to children. And this was something rather new. For most of American history, you didn't advertise to children, even if you were trying to sell products that were going to be used by children. Because think of it this way, kids don't have money. Kids ultimately aren't the ones that buy these things. Take something like a toy. Okay, yeah, the kid's going to play with the toy, but who's going to buy the toy? Mom and Dad are going to buy the toy. Grandma and Grandpa are going to buy the toy. So the toy maker, the person they really needed to convince, at least this was the old-fashioned thinking, about the merits of this toy was the parent. We got to convince Mom and Dad to buy this toy. But as we start getting into the 20s and 30s, and through the use of comic books by the time we get into the 30s and afterwards, there was a new marketing strategy that was starting to develop. And that was marketing things directly to children and teenagers. There was a new realization, yes, the kid's going to want this toy. And so the strategy from a toy maker or a marketer or advertiser in the toy industry is, we need to get the kid interested in this toy. And once the child is interested, they will do the rest of the hard work for us. They will bug and nag Mom and Dad or Grandpa and Grandma until they finally break down and buy the toy. Convince the kid will get the parents to buy this thing. Comic books were a way of directly marketing to children and teenagers. Go directly to that source. And so this was a new innovation we saw in comic books before we saw it in other places. Later on, we'll see it in other industries. Back when I was a kid, Saturday mornings were an important day for cartoons. You got special cartoons on Saturdays. And so you woke up Saturday morning, you were all excited because the Super Friends were going to be on or something like that. And so you would watch that, and all the advertising would be, toys and sugared cereal, things directed towards kids. And once the child got interested in it, then we would go and bug mom and dad that I want that toy I saw on the Saturday cartoon commercials that you would get. This is a new innovation. Let's talk about increasing criticism that was being generated towards comic books. Now, this is a common thing, and we've seen this with each one of our units that we've had so far. When we talked about silent movies, we talked about criticism leveled against silent movies. You read about it in Larry May's book on that. When we talked about swing music, we talked about criticism leveled against swing music, and Louis Ehrenberg told you about it in his book. And now we are reading Brad Wright's Comic Book Nation, and he's telling you about criticism that was leveled against the comic book industry. This is typical of popular culture and elements of popular culture. There tends to be those that dislike aspects of popular culture and want to criticize it. Comic books were particularly ripe for this kind of criticism. These comic books, and we'll talk more about this as we go, we've already talked about it a little bit, could be filled with representations of violence and sexuality, and particularly because so many of these comic books were directed at children and adolescents, these depictions of violence and sexuality could be disturbing to adults. Comic books could also paint a kind of negative picture of American society. In the last lecture, I talked about Batman and the dystopian vision of American society in early Batman comic books. You could see this throughout other comic books also. Laws were ignored. Courts were shown as being ineffective. Police could be ineffective or corrupt. Politicians were not working to solve the problems of people. There was a fear among some that comic books paint a very bleak picture of American society to children at a time in their life when they're very impressionable about these things. And I think this is page 27 in your book. It's from the first chapter where Brad Wright quotes a Chicago reporter criticizing comic books, and I have that block quote here for you in the PowerPoint. One of the things I always love about this guy, this reporter's name was Sterling North. What a great name. Isn't it almost ironic? It sounds like an alternate identity for a superhero. Sterling North. It sounds phony and made up. But apparently that was this guy's name, and he was a reporter for a Chicago newspaper. And this was, I think, 1941. So early on with the rise of comic books. And this was his impression of the negative effects of these things. The bulk of these lurid publications depend on their appeal upon mayhem, murder, torture, and abduction. Superman heroics, voluptuous females in scanty attire, blazing machine guns, hooded justice. Hooded justice means vigilantism. Right? And cheap political propaganda were to be found on almost every page. I get the feeling that maybe Sterling North wasn't super thrilled with some of the things going on in the Franklin Roosevelt administration and some of the liberal policies that were maybe going on. So he interpreted what some of this stuff about, I was just talking about, super reformer stuff, as political propaganda. Political propaganda were to be found on almost every page. Sadistic drivel, badly written and badly printed, a strain on young eyes and young nervous systems. One of the things we repeatedly see in criticism of popular culture is this fear of elements of popular culture almost like a drug, a stimulant that addicts the child. The effects of these pulp paper nightmares is that of a violent stimulant. Unless we want a coming generation even more ferocious than the present one, parents and teachers throughout America must band together to break the comics magazine, the comics magazine. Okay, I love when he talks about a coming generation even more ferocious than the present one. These are like your great grandparents, something like that. The idea that they were such a horrible generation is almost comical to us today. But that was the fear. And so comic books are going, from the very beginning, comic books are going to generate criticism. By the time we get to the early 1950s, we're going to talk about a really big wave of criticism directed against comic books that's frankly going to transform the nature of the comic book industry. But that criticism was there from the very beginning. Let's talk about World War II. World War II in comic books. We see some similarities between comic books and swing music in terms of the fears and the effects World War II had on the industry. There was a lot of fear when World War II started in the comic book industry that there were going to be a lot of restrictions imposed on publishing that were really going to hurt the comic book industry. Limits on the amount of paper you could get, making things more difficult to distribute comic books. One of the big fears was in terms of labor. If you wanted to get a new job during World War II, you had to inform the government. And if there was a special need, for example, in a war factory, you would be sent there before you were sent elsewhere. There was a priority list of industries in which available workers were sent to go and work. Well, you could imagine comic book publishing was very low on the list of priorities for workers, for getting new workers. So there was fear we might not be able to find enough, writers and illustrators and printers and office workers to put out comic books. There was genuine fear that the war effort was going to crimp the possibilities of the comic book publishing industry. And sure enough, there were limitations that were placed, and it did make certain things more difficult. However, the war also presented all kinds of new possibilities that greatly expanded the popularity of comic books. We see one of them right here. Here is a sailor sitting down next to a bunch of bombs right here, reading a comic book. Military service is going to be one of the things that helps expand the popularity of comic books. Comic books turned out to be an ideal form of entertainment for people in the military. Comic books are light, portable, you can fold them up, you can put them in a pocket, you could put them in a footlocker. You can transport them all over the world. When you get done reading your comic book, you can trade it with one of your fellow service members. I got a Batman. My buddy over there has got a Wonder Woman. I'm done reading mine. He's done reading his. I'll trade you. And you'd get that. It was an ideal form of entertainment. Millions of American women left the home and went into factories to work during the war. And because of that, there were a lot of kids that were left alone. There were a lot of sort of what known as latchkey kids that were left at home alone. Mothers in particular seem to feel guilty sometimes having to go to work and leave children alone. One of the things that moms could do is buy the kids a few comic books, when they went off to work, to keep the kid occupied and being happy that okay, I'm sorry, I'm sad mom's going, but I got some comic books to occupy me while mom is gone. Remember when in our swing music unit, I talked about people had jobs during World War II for the most part, but there weren't a lot of consumer goods to buy. Well, comic books were one of the things you could buy. There was a lot of pent-up demand during the Great Depression when money was tight. Parents weren't able to kick a lot of money down to kids. They weren't able to buy kids as many things as they would have liked to. But now, with full employment coming during World War II, there was more money in the family economy. Kids could buy more comic books during the war. Mom and dad could kick more money down to the kids to buy comic books. So it turned out comic books greatly expanded during the war. All that fear of the restrictions that were going to be placed on the industry, some of them turned out to be real and significant, but the industry was able to overcome many of them and dramatically increase sales during the war. Brad Wright also talks about tying together some of what we just talked about with our discussion now. The comic book industry was able to deflect some of the criticism that was directed toward the industry by very much getting on the patriotic bandwagon during the war. By using comic books to help support the war effort, comic books could paint a very patriotic and loyal image for the industry that helped deflect some of that criticism during the war. For example, Superman would, through a storyline, maybe encourage people in the storyline to buy war bonds. War bonds were used to help finance the war, and people were constantly encouraged to invest in war bonds during the war. And Superman would advocate for buying war bonds, and other comic book storylines would be filled with urging people to buy war bonds and things like that. And this did help deflect some of the criticism leveled against the industry. Brad Wright has a really interesting discussion of America's involvement in World War II and comic books, and how some comics were advocating for American entrance into World War II even before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. World War II begins in 1939 in Europe. That's when the fighting really gets going. But the United States was not involved with it in 39, 40, and most of 41. There was a very strong, in some history books, they still describe it as isolationism between World War I and World War II. So during the 1920s and 1930s, there was a lot of what gets described as isolationist sentiment. The Americans not wanting to get involved in another European war. Isolationism is kind of a bad description, because it turns out the United States was very interventionist in other parts of the world in the 1920s and 30s. We were all up in the business of Latin America, the Caribbean, during the 20s and 30s. We weren't isolationist when it came to Latin America. So a better way to describe this than isolationism was unilateralism. The United States wanted to decide where it was going to involve itself. And during the 1920s and 30s, there was a lot of determination to not get involved in another European war. Okay, but we were involved in other places in the United States. We weren't isolationist there. of those Americans that saw the growing threat of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, of all the Americans, Jewish Americans took the threat of Hitler and the Nazis the most seriously. Many Jews had family in Europe. Those that didn't have family kept track of what was happening to Jews in Europe, the anti-Semitism of Adolf Hitler and the anti-Semitism of Nazi ideology, the reports of Jews being rounded up, of death camps, American Jews not being able to get into contact with relatives in Europe, where other Americans were willing to overlook what was going on in Europe and try to deflect it and act like it had nothing to do with America. Some Jewish Americans were arguing that, hey, Hitler's a bad guy. The Nazis are bad people. This march of the Germans throughout Europe is not going to stop at Europe's door. And Hitler may be, and most likely will be, a threat to the United States someday. We may need to think about getting involved in this war. We also talked, going back to the silent movie unit, about the great number of Jews involved in the entertainment industry. We talked about why back then. And the entertainment business was something that Jews had some opportunity in Europe to work in. It was largely viewed as a disreputable form of business, and therefore if Jews worked in the entertainment industry, either as performers or managers or owners of theaters and things like that, it was allowed in many places in Europe. And when millions of Jews immigrated to the United States, some of them brought with them experience in the entertainment business, and they moved into the entertainment business in the United States. And Jews still found discrimination in the United States, and the entertainment business was one of the places where there was less discrimination against Jews. And so, just like with the silent movie unit, it is not surprising that there were a large percentage of Jews involved in the comic book industry as artists, as writers, as publishers. We talked about the creators of Superman, Joel Shuster and Jerry Siegel, were second-generation Jewish Americans. Their parents were immigrants that came to the United States. And Wright talks about second-generation Americans and that yearning to belong. Your parents are immigrants. You feel somewhat alienated sometimes because of that. You want to feel American as everybody else. And it's not coincidental that these children of immigrants go on to become people that create the all-American hero of Superman. But one of the really interesting things was the way in which there was a lot of this unilateral sentiment, this desire to not get involved in Europe's war. But in the pages of comic books, you saw the Nazis depicted as bad guys. Even before America gets involved in the war, even before the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. This is a issue of Submariner. Submariner was an old superhero who is fighting the Nazis more than 6 months before America enters World War II after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Wright talks about, although he doesn't identify the comic book, there was some comic book that had a storyline in 1939 about a Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, 2 years before the actual attack on Pearl Harbor. So pay attention to what Wright has to say about comic books pushing back against, at least some comic books, pushing back against that isolationist, unilateralist sentiment and painting the Nazis and the Germans as bad guys so that when war does break out, young comic book readers are ready to see these people as the enemy. Now, finally, let's talk about some of the racism that was depicted in these comic books during the war, also before and afterwards. Rather racist depictions could be found particularly against the Japanese enemy. Here you have Superman saying you can slap a Jap with an ugly caricature of someone of Japanese ancestry here. In Enright's chapter on this, he talks about the way in which comics and caricature, that the drawing that you get in comic books, could serve as a rather vicious form of racism because of how negatively you could draw characteristics of people in demeaning and racist ways. And so the Japanese were shown and depicted in like monkeys with buck teeth, with big spectacles, and really horrible racist depictions. The Germans could also be depicted in rather ugly ways, but nowhere near to the extent which the Japanese enemy was depicted. The Germans would often be depicted as scary and big, but the Japanese were often depicted as like monkeys and subhuman in terms of these depictions. And most problematic was that there wasn't much of a determination in comic books to differentiate between Japanese nationals, people in Japan that were the enemies of the United States, and Japanese Americans that were good, loyal Americans. Americans like all other Americans. That the Japs referred to both the enemy and also people of Japanese American descent who were also viewed suspiciously. During World War II, people of Japanese ancestry on the West Coast were rounded up and placed into concentration camps here. And if you want to understand, how did that happen? How were American citizens placed into camps, all of their civil rights taken away from them and placed into camps? How could that have happened here in America? Look at comic books in the 1940s during World War II and look at the depiction of not simply the Japanese enemy, but also Japanese Americans depicted in comic books. You start seeing things like that and it becomes easy. What happened was white Americans blurred the lines between the Japanese enemy and Japanese Americans and came to see them as being the same without significant distinction. Open a comic book during the time that dealt with anything dealing with the Japanese or Japanese Americans, and you come to understand how those camps could have been created like that. Okay, that's a good place to stop for this lecture, everybody. I'll see you next time.